over the last 4 or 5 years, studying the way the world economy has changed, or in the long term. I've gone back to kind of the ancient world to look at, can we understand the function of agriculture and archaeology and anthropology in an ancient context. But the next book, Ambition, A Transnational History, tentative title as I worked through and finished the manuscript, is really looking at the last 200, 250 years. This period from the emergence of European empire through movements for independence, consolidation of democratic nations, and then industrialization and globalization. So that book is really where I'm drawing this presentation from. I'm talking about the period today, mainly 1750 to 1850, with an emphasis on the period up until 1820. I really was made possible by a grant Monmouth University gave me this past summer, which let me travel to Mexico City and to Toronto and gather a lot of economic data about New France, ultimately British Canada, and then independent Canada, as well as New Spain, and then the movements towards Mexican independence in the early 19th century, and tons of stuff on later developments as they both grew as independent nations. I've worked with so many of the students in here this semester, learning techniques in History 310, about the way the economy of the United States changes. Students here at Monmouth, as well as students I work with in the summers at Columbia University, have contributed just dozens, hundreds of pages of research over the last 3 years to examine what constitutes an economy, how we measure economic growth. And that's where I really want to kind of start to get you guys familiar with what this work is about. Is that for the most part we examine gross domestic product as the way we measure economic progress in the 20th century and now the 21st century. As I asked questions coming out of the courses I was teaching as far back as 2002, I was really dissatisfied with the way GDP was calculated, and I felt like it undervalued the way nations negotiated with each other and tried to decide and measure what their productivity was. And so I struggled with that for 3 or 4 years, trying to figure out what was a better way to really account for the kinds of changes and the kinds of pressures nations felt as they adapted from agricultural subsistence through early stages of industrialization and then into global markets, and how do they actually participate in international trade relationships. In the earliest cases in the 19-teens and 20s, and then more aggressively in the 1950s and 60s. And so I had read a lot of Emanuel Wallerstein as a sociologist that talked about world systems theory and the uniqueness of how empire shaped world history after 1820, 1850, and found that lacking. Wanted to get more depth and look further back to see the roots of early globalization, the emergence of capitalism, and came across a Cambridge economist. His name is Partha Dasgupta. Dasgupta published an article back in 2012 that intersected precisely with the work and the questions I was asking, trying to figure out why GDP was failing us in a context where we were trying to emerge from the last Great Recession. And Dasgupta's main work is on social capital. How do people take education, soft skills, work together, and transform and adapt to new economic conditions across time? He was most interested in the period since 1980. Most economists think in terms of daily economic cycles, if not daily, then weekly or quarterly. They have very narrow, short time cycles for analysis, and Dasgupta is no exception to this. What he proposed in The Economist, and it was a derivation of something he had done for the UN, was to instead look at real wealth. What is the asset value of a given nation? And instead of just calculating kind of their productivity in a given year, Dasgupta instead measured the value of their infrastructure in relationship to their agricultural or mining product, and then extended that to include the human capital. is social capital. How educated the population is, how adaptive, how flexible is the population to new circumstances. And so he monetizes all of those figures for the United Nations in 2012. In doing so, he comes up with a very different measure of wealth in the American economy. This past week, there was a big headline talking about how China had surpassed the United States in terms of annual GDP for the first time. Produced in the last year $17.6 trillion in terms of traded product. The United States was at $17.4 trillion, and so this was the mark that we didn't think was going to come for another decade or so, but it arrived just now. Dasgupta's measure in terms of real wealth still places the United States far and away ahead of where China is currently located. China's growth is rapid in terms of asset value. They're rapidly reorganizing in a way that we hadn't seen before in world history. But the actual wealth of the United States, of what's been produced and kind of constructed here in terms of the agricultural infrastructure, in terms of our railroad and highway system, the type of air traffic system that we've created, plus the overall education and flexibility of the population, places the United States as by far the wealthiest nation in the world, where, extrapolating from Dasgupta's data, you had in 2012 about $425 trillion in world assets that were available that we could document. And the United States at that point held about $118 trillion of that, so a little bit more than a quarter. China, comparatively at that point, was about $20 trillion in total assets. So they were producing as much income as they had developed infrastructure. And so places like China and India are rapidly trying to catch up and do what the United States had done for the last 150 years. That kind of process, that debate, and having a new tool to measure and figure out how economic growth unfolded, I wanted to read that back in time. And so that's essentially the project of the last 3 years. Figuring out what kind of asset value every major empire and nation has had in human history. I shouldn't say every. Like the largest 75 empires and nations in world history. And so that's what we created, was a global asset map back in 2013 that actually, in monetary terms, measured the relative size of various empires and nations over the last 5,000 years. At this point, I'm going to put the timer on myself so I don't go on too long. These are projects that my students have done for the History 310 class, just using this tool of asset value analysis to then decide and kind of analyze the way the American economy has changed. There are about 4 of them. I should be done before the 4th one's finished, but it gives me a good sense to kind of let you guys be distracted when I'm getting boring, and you can look at stuff and kind of tune back in. But what I wanted to start off and say is that the premise of Ambition, this new book I'm working on, are a set of questions, really 3 questions. What role did religious institutions play in the economic growth of European nations between 1450 and 1750? So particularly the Catholic Church and how it was organized as an economy rather than an ideological or political institution for those 300 years. Did the decentralization and the fragmentation of the church then have an impact in the idea of European national identity formation? But more importantly, did that decentralization lay a template, create an opportunity for, in the Western Hemisphere, North American independence movements to fill a vacuum where they could basically use race as a crutch to build non-religious national identities? And so in the case of the United States and Canada and Mexico, that's kind of a key question that you guys are going to see me work through a little bit here today. The final question for the entire book is then, how did these more secular, more racially defined national identities evolve into global, corporate, or commercial forms by the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century? How did corporate identities based in scientific categories and scientific organization begin to emerge after 1870? So that's all later stuff. For you guys, there are 3 particular examples I want to talk through right now and get your feedback on and be able to have a greater conversation about. In New Spain, between 1650 and 1820, as I looked at the research and data I gathered this summer, I really picked out that there was a very slow pattern of growth. It's striking compared to the American data, how slowly both New Spain and eventually Mexico adapted. It's very much an example of a decentralized economic system with little authority to kind of bind it together and push innovation during those 2 centuries. And at the front of it, I looked at a place called the state of Veracruz, and particularly the free township of San Lorenzo. This is a place where a man named Yanga basically fought a 30-year revolt against Spanish authorities from 1604 to about 1630. 1630 is when the free township is recognized by the government to say they will remain free, they will not be attempted to be re-enslaved and integrated back into New Spain. They're based in the Orizaba Mountains. I forgot to bring you guys the maps and stuff. So I do have maps and resources to kind of situate this for you. This is in central Mexico along the eastern coast, about 150 miles east of where Mexico City is. And so this is the primary trade port during this period. And so it's important that there is actually a free maroon community of Africans there that has been able to defy local authority and resist the kind of centralization and political organization of the region that I see bearing out into the 19th century, or more importantly, I guess, for this presentation, into the 18th century. When you see traders coming from Spain, most notably a man named Don Miguel de Uriarte, and he essentially is the main contractor to bring slaves into New Spain, not just in Mexico, but even down as far as Venezuela and Peru, from 1760 to 1766, which is this very important time period for how these economies begin to change. And that's where I want to situate you guys as we start, is that you get people like Uriarte importing slaves into New Spain, trying to adapt what had been a colonial Mexican economy based on silver. Silver had been the dominant currency for commerce for the previous century. It's how they emerged as a dominant global empire that now is beginning to shift, and they're trying to develop slavery as the basis of an economy in New Spain. At this point, 1750, the asset value analysis that I did in Mexico City shows that New Spain was worth, in today's terms, about $17 billion. So relatively, we were just talking about China bringing in about 1,000 times more money in a year than the entire colony was valued at in terms of infrastructure, assets, population, back in 1750. So a much larger system today that's rooted in the forces that we see taking root in the 17th and 18th centuries. But it's about a $17 billion colony, and so keep that number in mind. That's kind of a fundamental number to keep in mind for the 18th century. What we also found when we were digging through the archives was that the relative value had grown by 1870, middle of the 19th century, to about $65 billion. So significant growth, but still slow. It's not very rapid given the fact that 120 years had passed. In contrast, in British America, my second case is to look at a man, two men. Like I said, we had Yanga on the one side as a slave rebel in Mexico in the 17th century, and Uriarte as a slave trader attempting to kind of shift the nature of the economy 100 years later. In North America, the two cases I look at are, I chose some local ones since we're here at Monmouth University. The first is Isaac Norris. Isaac Norris is a slave trader in Philadelphia from 1704 to 1732. And he essentially is the mayor of the city in 1724. He goes on to serve on this local kind of circuit court. He's appointed to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court prior to the American Revolution, but he refuses the appointment. But he builds his estate, he builds his political career around trading slaves through Philadelphia. And there are a number of slaves that we can get into and talk about their stories and the importance of slavery to the Philadelphia economy in the middle of the 18th century. But I also wanted to tie it back, this is one of the things I brought in just for you guys, was that I discovered Perth Amboy was a major slave trading sport. There's a huge auction in Perth Amboy that we have documented over in the library that was trading hundreds of slaves per month to Philadelphia, to a lesser extent to New York. And so this was a commerce, not primarily enslaved, but like 20–30% of the trade coming through these auctions is enslaved right here, just outside of New Brunswick. And so this is the way, prior to the revolution, you're seeing growth in the American economy. We're more used to talking about tobacco. We're more used to talking about, by the early 1800s, cotton. But the use of slaves as currency, in the ways that Uriarte was trying to do in Veracruz, in Mexico City, and Venezuela, at the same time, is actually taking off and really driving the way the North American economy, the British North American economy, is growing. So the hub in Philadelphia, with people like Isaac Norris, is driving this trade. And you're having, by the time of the revolution, my second figure is a man named Titus. Folks who do New Jersey colonial history may have heard of Titus before. Somewhat.
Colonel Ty?
Yes, Colonel Ty basically joins the British Army to fight against George Washington to dismantle slavery in central New Jersey. Runs raids from Sandy Hook between 1778 to 1780 when he's shot through the wrist in Colt's Neck, and eventually dies from gangrene. His wound is not clean, it gets infected, and he dies. But Colonel Ty basically is one of these folks like Yanga, a century or more removed, that's essentially trying to fight for a freer, more open economy, but it's not permissible at this point because the economy is increasingly dependent on the trade in slaves to move not agricultural products, but to allow commercial flexibility. Slaves are a form of money. And that's the single biggest conclusion I was going to pitch to you guys today, is that we can't just understand slaves as property to produce various silver mines, gold mines, indigo fields, rice fields, sugar. I sent an article out yesterday that was a lot about the growth of cotton that people are focusing on. But slaves were actually a really useful form of money during this time period. And in fact, for North America, the use of slaves as money is what enables the growth of the United States after the Revolution to surpass the growth that we see in Mexico. And so this is numbers that I did a couple years ago. But in 1750, North American colonies in terms of asset value were only worth about $6 billion in today's terms. So that's about 1/3 of what New Spain was at the same time. Much smaller infrastructure, capital investment, presence of people building commercial enterprise. But by 1870, as a result of importing slaves aggressively until 1810, and then, especially in New York and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, leveraging the increased slave population as capital to then build extended road systems, new canals, new railroad systems. That presence of slaves as currency enables the financing of the infrastructure that enables commercial growth and industrialization in the antebellum period. So that's the massive growth. That's why the North is able to beat the South in the Civil War. It changes the entire fundamental framework of what is emerging in North America. And so that process then leads to the comparison where I look at New France and British Canada during the same time period, 1750 to 1860. And I look at the story of Marie Joseph Angelique, who in 1734 nearly burned down the entire city of Montreal. Particularly the courthouse and a lot of the municipal buildings were burned in this fire. It's still up in the air whether she was actually the person who set fire to this, but she was the one who was convicted and hanged publicly for this. And she was a slave owned in that space, decided she was angry at her owner, who's a widow in Montreal, and then in setting the fire caused this massive destruction and becomes the face of slave revolt in Canada. On the other side of the equation at virtually the same time, Louis Curot de Saint-Germain, between 1737 and 1749, is the foremost slave trader in Canada, in Montreal, and in generally the province of Quebec. Saint-Germain is basically importing thousands of slaves, and they're not there to be farmers. They're there largely domestic servants, metal crafts, but mostly to serve as a facility to exchange different goods and services. They are money in the province during this time period. And so went back to a guy who wrote about Saint Germain in 1923 and started kind of mapping out, when I went up to Toronto, what the nature of this economy was prior. This is 100 years prior to the independence of Canada. And so the the province of Quebec, and really there's not much more to what we think of as Canada back then, was about a $9 billion economy. So still half the size of Mexico, but larger than what we saw in British North America. And what just astonished me was you had even slower growth in that region by 1870. You only got to $32 billion in investment in asset value in that colony over that period. By the time Canada becomes independent, it's still, a smaller economy than Mexico was. And so that's what sets up the table for me in the 20th century. It's a very different story about Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and how they all industrialize aggressively over the century that follows, from 1870 to 1970. But that's the stuff I wanted to talk with you guys about today, the early material. How did slavery fit into the development of a set of New World economies? How do we compare and kind of value the different ways they went about this? And particularly, what is the sense of escaping the historiographical boundary we've developed, where slaves can only be seen, or we read them as human beings, as population, we read them culturally, but we don't look at them as a form of exchange, a currency to kind of develop other kind of economic institutions in these colonies that then become independent nations. And so my last point is then to wrap up with the idea that for the US, the idea of centralized government, and particularly the use of the centralized government to borrow larger amounts of money to build infrastructure in the late 18th and early 19th century, enabled the acquisition of slaves on a bigger scale in the late 18th century, but that then laid the foundation for faster, sustainable growth in the United States. Is that leveraging process, and I really look a lot at Alexander Hamilton being ahead of his time in understanding how banking worked in relationship to developing commercial markets this way, was much more sophisticated than anything we saw in New Spain / Mexico, New France / Canada, where they had decentralized, more social integration, Marie Joseph Angelique actually had her main